Hi, everybody. My name is Gabes Torres. We're just going to jump right in, talking about some core parts of running a campaign, of creating or crafting a campaign. I hope to give you these slides that you can return to for review or as a guide. But first, I want to start with taking care of ourselves. I am at the intersection of mental health and of organizing. And it is critical, it is my responsibility to remind us to always check in with our bodies, our breath, especially in the line of work that you are in. The rates of activist burnout climb almost every year. And the cost of not temporarily, momentarily resting is that a lot of organizers and defenders have found it hard to get back on the field after they've crashed. And so even though it is hard to access care, to access rest, especially since you're in close proximity to the suffering and the struggles of masses of everyday people, I think there is such a thing as um, taking a moment to, again, like take a break, because I don't want you to get into compassion fatigue, and all other manifestations of activist burnout, because it does take a long time for folks to get back on track after burning out. And I don't want that for us. That almost happened to me. So I'm encouraging you to, as much as you can, as wisely as you can, practice community care. Okay. Again, I hope to give you these slides. This is a bit of a review of campaign elements. As y'all know, a campaign is a sustained set of collective actions that strives to reach a social justice goal beyond one-off mobilizations, beyond one-off protests or rallies, one-off election cycles. Ideally, this is a long-term commitment, your campaign. And there are many ways to create a template for a campaign. This template can be changeable and contextual or applicable to what works for your team, what is suitable for you and your context and your goal. So you can consider this template as a point of reference, but it's not fixed, okay? Um, so a campaign goal, as you know, is the big change you want to see or the problem that you want to fix. The example here, I used these slides from another workshop from some time ago, but the example here says that maybe a campaign goal can be to advocate for anti-carceral and accessible systems of mental health care in your city. I'm aware that y'all's goals are more related to demilitarization. So your campaign goal, which is your overall broad vision, an example that you can use if you don't have one already is, let's say, to pass a bill that has to do with demilitarization or to up human rights protections from military. Another example would be to limit military equipment transfers within your jurisdiction or within your city. It could be to require law enforcement agencies to justify and publicly disclose the acquisition of some military style equipment. One big example took place in Costa Rica, where they have constitutionalized demilitarization at the national level. They did so by abolishing standing armies, or limiting military roles. So you can look up constitutional demilitarization, something that Costa Rica achieved back in, what was it, in 40, a long time ago. And then you can look up and see how they did that. One other example, which is one that I participated in back when I was living in Duwamish or in Seattle, Washington, was I was a part of the legislative advocacy team for the Philippine Human Rights Act. And the Philippine Human Rights Act, or the PHRA, sought to suspend U.S. security assistance. So the U.S. gave a lot of money to the Philippines police and military force through military training, equipment, again, like financing in general. And the bill, the Philippine Human Rights Act, aimed to suspend this financial assistance, which is like millions of dollars, until the Philippine government meets a set of human rights aligned conditions, because so much of the police and military were violating human rights violations. So unless they did some investigative work and that they met the standards um, for human rights conditions, it sounds super reform-y as opposed to wanting to overthrow empire altogether, but sometimes we got to work with the systems that we have in order to realistically get to the places we want to keep our community safe. So I know that it feels icky because again, it feels more reform than it is to abolish slash to overthrow. But sometimes in order to sustain change, we got to work with what we have and we got to be realistic about it, unfortunately. So it's one of those things that we have to build capacity for, right? It doesn't mean that we're doing poor work, but we got to we got to have a strong inner relational fortitude before we get to the place where we actually overthrow a deeply entrenched institution that is military. Okay, so campaign elements. As you know, the strategy is the path that takes us from our present position up to where we want to go or where we get closer to our most ideal situation. Okay, your strategy can include this. Again, it's not fixed. You can kind of like use this as a template, but it is critical to have both a root cause or situational analysis and a power structure analysis before you determine your tactics. And of course, your timeline, because your goals, your objectives need to be time bound. So usually, folks who are relatively new to grassroots organizing, even those who have been organizing at a grassroots level, think that they always have to start with tactics. That is a very common misconception because, so I'll give you one example. There was one day, like it was 2 years ago, there was a rally at the Israeli embassy in Manila. And it was after October 7, 2023. And this rally demanded the end of Israeli genocidal incursion in Palestine. During the action, I spoke with some of the organizers at the action. And what I found out was that no one knew the name of the ambassador of the Israeli embassy in Manila. They didn't know the name of the ambassador, much less the other key players who are instrumental or influential in meeting our campaign goals, which at the time the goal was to demand the end of Israeli genocidal incursion in Palestine. But none of the folks at the rally, as far as I knew when I talked with people, they didn't even know the name of the ambassador. And we need these names. We need the names of the people of authority, of the people in power. We need to know who they are, the extent of their influence in relation to our goal. We need to know what or who keeps them in power. We need to know how we can get them to meet our demands. And with long-term grassroots organizing, it is strategically more impactful to start with a root cause analysis and power structure analysis before determining the tactics to use, because you will be more effective. You'll be more effective when you analyze the scope and the depth of the problem you're trying to solve and the power structures or the authority figures that you are up against or who have the power and the access to meet your demands. Okay, so with your analysis of power and of the problem, you will use this data to select which tactics will have the most impact. Okay, so you can't just always start with a rally or with a protest. Not that they're not powerful, they are, But again, you got to know the key players. You got to know the name of the ambassador. You got to know the name of the state official. You got to know who can meet your demand. So let your analysis of the problem of power inform the way you formulate your next steps. Okay. So, so we're not going to talk that much about root cause analysis. Perhaps a lot of y'all have been, discussing this amongst your campaigners or your organization. But these are examples of models and frameworks that you can use to analyze your problem. And you need to know you need to know your problem. You need to know, you need to have a strong root cause analysis because you'll be able to know the details of your demands. You need to know how you make the demand. And in order to know how to make the demand, you got to know what the extent or the depth of the problem is. Its context, who causes it, who is harmed directly by the problem. So you're also, with a strong root cause analysis, you're also able to know how to articulate the problem when you start inviting people to join your campaign or your organization. You will be more equipped to translate your data into the invitation. So this is kind of like an example from No Cop Academy. They put this in their flyer, they put this in their toolkit. And I think you can use this as an example to also formulate or to create your flyer or to create the invitation that this is going to affect you negatively if you don't participate in the campaign. Or if we continue to ignore this problem, this will affect you. It'll be to your disadvantage if you don't support or take notice of this campaign. Okay, so that's a bit of your root cause analysis. Now we pay attention to power structure analysis. So in movement work, it's important to know or to have our shared theory of power. This can be as simple as it's with two parts. It's in two parts. One is to understand people power, the people's power, your power. You are part of the people. And second is to understand structural or systemic power. So this is your target or your opponent's power. So in understanding your power, which is part one, you ask questions like, who do I know who has influence? This can be social influence, like people who have a relatively large following. This could be legal influence. These can be your neighbors or your friends who happen to be lawyers or have second degree connections with legislators. These can be neighbors or friends who are even managers of certain industries or local businesses that have influence over your goal. This can be doctors or professors. So this is you assessing your social ecosystem of influence. Who do I know who have certain degrees of access to information and resources that can further my campaign goal? Why do I know them? How do I know them? And how well do I know them? And how can I reach and influence them in pulling them to my side, to supporting your campaign goal? This is from the book No Shortcuts by the great Jane McAlevey. This is a chart that helps map out who you know who has influence and has access to, again, information and resources to potentially support your campaign. In this chart, it says in the center, people, or AKA the workers. Ideally, the way that you chart this out is you put your name in the center. And then you create the map of all your connections who have certain proximities to power and access to information. So this chart helps you understand that you have more organizing power than you think. The idea that this chart is trying to highlight is that there's power in numbers, there's power in the people. And if you do this with your organization, if you kind of like combine all of y'all's charts together, you see that you, again, have more organizing power than you think. You have so many connections with all of your social ecosystems, all your your worker maps combined, right? This can be like an ever-growing, ever-expanding map too, because who knows who you might meet along the way in your organizing or in your mobilizations. So keep it fluid. It doesn't have to be fixed, okay? But the idea is to know, um, who is in your circle, who can support you, and who you can invite to join your movement. So the second part is to understand structural and systemic power. Okay. So we often think of power as in systemic power in a traditional top-down sense, which is to the left of the slide, where workers take orders from supervisors, supervisors from CEOs. Maybe at the very top is the state governor, the mayor, the president. So with this traditional model on the left, the tendency is to think that everyone is at the bottom of the pyramid and that they have to follow orders. Otherwise, they'll get fired, they'll get punished. And this traditional view of power can potentially and has always disempowered us because we believe that the pyramid has a wide and strong and immovable foundation. However, there's an alternative way of looking at systemic power, which is the upside down triangle. And here, which is to the right, we see that the foundation is inherently unstable. With this upside down triangle, we understand that the powerful are powerful, but they are not all powerful. They're only powerful because of their stakeholders, because of their donors, their customers, even their workers, which might even include some of us or some of our friends or some who are in our family even. And their social systems or their pillars of support, as we can see in the chart, are the ones who keep them in power. Even we keep them in power, maybe as their customers, those of us who are still subscribed to certain services that are incredibly complicit to systemic oppression. And the majority, us included, have passively consented to their structural legitimacy and ultimately the larger status quo that benefits the rich and the powerful. Okay, so it's helpful to look into these quotes by Beautiful Trouble and Dan Hunter, who speak more imaginatively and realistically, really, about the issues of the traditional view of power, as well as the need to look at power from an upside down triangle perspective. Okay, now we move on to the exercise of targeting under your power structure analysis. So before determining your tactics, and in order to meet your goal, you'll need to identify a primary target. And your primary target is the person who has the power to fix the problem or create the change that you want. This is the person, this is the authority figure who can meet your demand. So this image that you see on the slides, it helps make systemic oppression look less vague. So when we say dismantle empire or dismantle oppression, oppression is such a broad thing. There's so many institutions and entities and procedures under the bigger, broader idea and reality that is systemic oppression. And we can't always just throw the slogan undo oppression um or dismantle, like it just feels so overwhelming since it's such a big ecosystem. So it's important in order to make it feel less overwhelming, it's important to dissect and map out the pillars that hold regime. Okay. So as opposed to, again, viewing systemic oppression as this broad idea of regime as your primary target, oppression can't be your primary target. it's actually more efficient to focus on just one person as a primary target. Yeah, so it's ideal to have like a singular political actor, perhaps even elected official or CEO as a primary target. So back to the Philippine Human Rights Act, which I was involved with some time ago. In order to pass the PHRA bill, we needed to influence a number of legislators to write their signature and sign off on the bill for it to be passed. So in that case, we chose for our team, we chose two, one of which includes a senator who was opposed to the bill because he was like an ally of Boeing. The other was more in favor of the PHRA. So it can also, the target can also be somebody who is likely to be for your campaign as well. It doesn't necessarily have to always be somebody who's opposed to your campaign goal, okay? But anyway, so once you identify the primary target, you then identify the secondary targets. So who are the people and the entities who maintain the primary target's position of power? And who are also the individual who are these are the same individuals and entities who can also take the power, the primary target's power away as well. So the primary target will very likely have donors and stakeholders. And if they have businesses, they have buyers and customers. They also have board of trustees. They have media who's loyal to them, right? And who keep their status, their reputation shiny. And these entities and individuals, as said, are called the pillars of support. Again, they keep the primary target's position of power. So knowing the secondary targets can be as important as knowing your primary ones. Is there an individual or a group of individuals who have the power to remove the primary target's power? We don't have time to talk about concession costs and vulnerability to disruption costs. So okay, really quickly, I'll just give the link to understanding concession and vulnerability to disruption costs. So basically, these are tools that help you measure or assess whether the target is prepared to meet your campaign demands at a specific time. Because sometimes some of these targets or these legislators will not be like they're probably going through a certain election cycle, and so you wouldn't want to waste your energy on a target who is very not likely to meet your campaign goals. So I'll just give you a link on how to make those assessments. Okay, now we move on to power mapping. So this is a power map. So with your the first chart that we use, the worker chart, right? Knowing your social ecosystem of influence. You get the information from that map and you drag it over to this map. And you also use the other map, the pillars of support map, to the pillars of support or the secondary targets of your primary one. You drag all that in one map. As you can see, this is already a lot of work, but this is super critical in identifying your tactics, as I keep mentioning. So again, the people, the social groups you know, and then you put your primary and secondary targets in this same map. And you lay them out on the basis of, on the spectrum of influential and non-influential. Like how influential are they to your campaign? Or how much power do they have in meeting your campaign goals? How much of them agree? Like you see the horizontal line here, their spectrum of how they favor, how they'll sign off on your campaign goals, and how much will they be opposed to it as well. See? So in power mapping, you analyze the social ecosystem in which you and your primary target exist. So you map out your relationships and associations, and you assess how they influence your campaign, whether positively or negatively, and how they're also connected to your target. So who is it in your circles would favor your campaign? Who would also be opposed to it? I'm aware that some of y'all will have another training video or workshop about the spectrum of allies. So you have to be able to also know who is not in favor of your campaign goals. Because the goal is to not ignore them or continue to reject them. The hope is to get them closer to the agree section over here. Even if it's just like 1 degree closer to agreeing to your campaign goal. Again, power in numbers, right? We don't abandon them. We don't incessantly argue with them. The hope is to get them closer to allyship as opposed to opposition. And I'm excited for y'all to watch the training video on Spectrum of Allies. It's such an important one. So in this power map, you also map out the social groups or your relationships and how they're connected to your target. So who in your social circles does your target care about? Who in your social groups does your target admire? Your target is afraid of or benefit the most from? I'll give examples shortly, but essentially, power mapping is an exercise or is a tool to identify the connections that you have who hold influence over your primary target, and how then can we influence or mobilize these connections to influence your target to get your target to support your campaign and meet your demand. This is an actual example of a power mapping exercise that we did for the Philippine Human Rights Act campaign. And in this case, what does it say here? Oh yeah, our primary target was Adam Smith. The reason why we chose Adam Smith was because I lived in a zip code where I was a constituent of his, and as a congressman, he has to listen to my demands because I was a constituent of it. So those are things that you also have to consider. Like I have power over him, supposedly, because I am his constituent. So with a map like this, you can see that so many people are like on the right, and you can see that most of our social groups in our organization are mostly politically aligned with us. It will be ideal if you really mix up the people that you know. Like we need to have some proximity to people and I know that this is tricky because we'd rather be with people who politically align with us. But, in long-term organizing, I think we need to mix up the people groups that we know, and get as many folks as possible to join our movements, even those whom we don't exactly agree with. But also that's more complicated and a lot easier said than done. Okay, so in doing these power mapping exercises, this will inform the way you choose your tactic. Because we ask questions like, does my primary target, does this congressman have smaller businesses that he runs or that he is partnered with? And if so, can we find out the business's weak points? If it's a cafe, if it's a restaurant, how do they treat their workers? Can we research on whether their food or their bathrooms are sanitary? Can we persuade the workers of the business about the funny business that their bosses are doing? Can we persuade the customers to refuse to go back to that same cafe or restaurant this congressman is co-running because they're doing some funny business when it comes to human rights violations, that kind of thing? So we track again, like their pillars of support. We find the Achilles heel and we leverage that information to keep the target accountable and to have them meet your campaign goals. So it's important to also so one example, if the target is an elected official or a senator or congressman in this case, we have to understand that their underlying power is political. So, how do you choose your tactic? The tactic that you should choose must cost him votes, must cost him contributions. In the case of Adam Smith, and if he's not being cooperative, we choose a tactic that would make him look bad in front of his constituents, in front of potential voters. Okay. If it's a company that you're up against, or a CEO of a company, we choose a tactic that will cost them customers or will cost them their time. The BDS movement has a lot of examples about how they've been targeting certain companies. They're doing an incredible job inviting people to boycott or desubscribe from certain institutions. So the point is, if the target doesn't support your campaign, make it hard for them to do their job because you have this power map and all this information about their funny business. You have the ability to show them that it will cost them if they don't support your campaign. We weaponize this data from your power map, your analysis to weaken your opposing target's status, legitimacy, even like moral appearance, and weaken their position of power if they don't meet your demands. So pressure, pressure, pressure. This is the only time that I love using the word weaponize, by the way. Okay, so these charts again are dynamic. They're not supposed to be static or fixed. Keep coming back to the chart or the map as a group. Who knows what you'll find out along the way or in the duration of your campaign. So keep building. Okay, let's skip to tactics here. Okay, so tactics are the concrete steps in meeting your campaign objectives. So a set of tactics is the plan of action, whether it's letter writing, petition gathering, giving public testimony, marching, picketing, blocking access, and sitting in. So tactics are your coordinated sequence of actions that are carried out over a defined time frame, okay? Designed to steadily strengthen the organization while escalating pressure on the target until they concede to your demands. So the tactics are the social action activities that, again, you use to achieve your campaign goal. And as a group, y'all get to decide together the tactics that deliver the greatest impact for the energy and resource you invest based on your problem analysis, your root cause analysis, and your power analysis. So you've probably heard this before. To diversify tactics, diversify, diversify, diversify. Campaigns are rarely ever won or rarely ever succeed if we only use one or two tactics. We don't over rely on rallies or protests all the time. They're important, but we can't use them twice. We can also mix it up and not mix it up, we measure and assess which tactics have the most impact. We can do phone barrages. We can meet with legislators or their aides of whom you are their constituents, etc. So there are two ways to differentiate tactics. So we've got expressive and instrumental tactics. Expressive tactics ask the question, how do we affirm our values and build group identity? So these are protests, vigils, marches, staging sit-ins, carnivals, graffiti, open mics, galleries. These are tactics that come directly from the heart, from the gut. You express what you believe in. You express who you're mad at. You express what you're fighting against. You express what you've had enough of. You express what you're fighting for, what you want more of. So expressive tactics give the digestible, memorable messages and stories. They deliver these messages across, even the short ones that are easier. Ideally, you would use short ones that are easier for everyday people to remember. So you hear chants that go, the occupation has got to go. One job should be enough. Ceasefire now. So through expressive tactics, these people are going to know that there's an issue. And they're going to start talking about it with their communities, with their families, with their friends and spouses. So these expressive tactics help with recruitment, or sometimes it's called absorption. You try to absorb as many people as possible to join your campaign or your organization. They also help energize us as a collective. They tell beautiful, powerful stories about the impacts of oppression, not beautiful stories, sorry, impactful stories about the impacts of oppression, as well as the beautiful stories about the revolution. In the organizing community, sometimes expressive tactics get some criticism if they are the only tactics overused by the group. Expressive tactics focus more on external impact or the impact outside of the organization as opposed to the internal work and life of the organization. So this is why we need to diversify tactics with both expressive and instrumental ones. Just as a quick tip, when you build a slogan or brainstorm a slogan, make sure that it's invitational. Something like, I don't know, something to do with joining us. We have one target. All of us have one target. We have one problem, and we can defeat XYZ problem together. Bring a strong invitational voice and always follow up. So there should be like a follow up, and there should be a concrete call to action. So usually some of us bring QR codes for folks to like refer back to later. And again, as much as possible, get as many numbers or email addresses as possible to get people to join your team. Okay, instrumental tactics are, they ask the question, what is this action actually achieving for our campaign? Okay, so this can be letter writing, petition gathering, lobbying, phone barrages, divestment, etc. So these tactics are concerned with concrete results beyond beyond expressing ourselves and our movement. These are actions that aim to achieve measurable goals. These instrumental tactics are, again, instrumental to our goal. These are often the less sexy parts of solidarity movements because they will include a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of phone calls or video chats, a lot of tedious tasks like emailing, revising email templates, more meetings. So an expressive tactic can also be transformed into an instrumental one. Like one example, let's say you do an open mic of music and poetry by climate survivors. And towards the end of the open mic, a member of one of your group does a brief teach-in on the existing efforts to further climate litigations and reparations. And you have the attendees of the open mic sign the petition or have them email during the event. You can ask them to bring out their phones and email the elected official, your primary and secondary targets during the actual event. So an expressive tactic can be transformed into an instrumental one in that case, because the open mic became an email barrage, right? Blockades are also both expressive and instrumental because you are getting the word out about your cause publicly while also interfering the workflow of a company contributing to the problem. There's a recent one that happened about 2 years ago when there was a blockade that happened in the Boeing parking lot against Israeli genocide. So that's another example of combining together expressive and instrumental tactics. So I will be sending y'all, I hope that was helpful. Again, please start with a problem or a root cause analysis and a power structural analysis before determining your tactic, because you will determine and measure your tactic on the basis of that analysis. And keep putting pressure, stay sharp. I bless y'all in your movements, and thank you for having me.